the strength of the right wing in the United States, it'll probably resume. And I think that's one of the reasons, one of the many reasons, in fact, why you had the expansion of the Black population in Ghana, the Black population in South Africa, etc. People are deciding to jump before they're pushed.
And I'm sorry.
Sure.
We just need to identify our station. You're listening to WPFW, Jazz and Justice Radio, 89.3 FM. This is Joni Eisenberg, and we're blessed to be with for the next hour Dr. Gerald Horne and Dr. Greg CARR. We are talking about the farce of You Lie, understanding the roots of U.S. fascism and what is to be done. We're going to get into what is to be done a little more in this next and last hour, but we're going to start this hour off with a piece called To the North Star by Gaston Neal and Fred Foss.
Beyond the thunder and lightning, past the clouds, over the dark night, she reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red hot light of the North Star. She opened the earth, rocking with blood-soaked feet. She challenged the whip, the gun, the knife. She challenged the fire, pulled from the bodies of slaves, made into laws, prisons, and courts.
And that is just the first a couple minutes of a beautiful 9-minute piece by our own Gaston Neal, who is very much a part of the DC community and now an ancestor, heard on WPFW, originally from Pittsburgh, together with Fred Foss, a beautiful musicians, originally from my neck of the woods in Queens, also a part of he actually went to my high school. We went to the same high school.
Did he, Joni? Really?
Yes, Fred Foss and Gaston Neal, part of our WPFW family. Absolutely.
Joni, let me mention, yesterday I was actually down on 14th Street, Brother Kwasi and Sister Kim, who sell books right there at the corner of 14th and U on the weekends. And we were talking about, ironically, the new school of African thought, as we know, which was in that neighborhood. And of course, one of the co-founders, and the ancestors don't make any mistakes, was the great Gaston Neal. And we were as we were standing there talking about books and ideas and how much DC has changed, standing on that corner with them, talking about the new school of African thought and so many other things. We were watching how the changes in the community have just overwhelmed the gentrification. And of course, we know the new school for African thought. Oh man, I'm so glad you played Gaston Neal. That was community education. And so, Gerald, as Gerald is talking, as you're talking, the invaluable service as people are listening, scribbling down notes as you're talking, Gerald, writing down sources, writing down things they didn't know. This is one of the avenues that we have to really continue to expand and promote, that will help us think for ourselves. This information is invaluable, and so to hear Gaston Neal's voice and to know what he did and all of his through all of his challenges and to emerge on the other side, it's just a beautiful thing. I just wanted to say that, Joni.
Thank you. And of course, that's a 9-minute piece. We only played 2 minutes, and I want to thank Gaston too. It's because of Gaston Neal who introduced me to Tom Porter that I'm on these airwaves.
Wow.
He introduced me to PFW. But I also want to say that Friday was Gaston's birthday, July 1st. And I just want to give a shout out to the amazing birthdays we had last week. Of course, our own Dory Ladner, who was born June 28th, together with Dr. Elise Galati from Howard University. Yes. And interestingly enough, also that week is Medgar Evers, born July 2nd. And he was born the same day and the same year as Patrice Lumumba.
Yes.
July 2nd. And of course, Stokely Carmichael was, I believe, June 29th. And we cannot forget Lena Horne, born June 30th. Right. So we had quite a week of
and somebody who would say, who of course the records seem to indicate was actually born August the 4th, but who always claimed throughout his life that his birthday was the 4th of July, and that's Pops, Louis Armstrong.
Absolutely.
Who, if he were here, ironically, of course, I'm thinking about and going back to what you raised, Gerald, in terms of internationalism, this whole embrace of in solidarity and cultural kind of similarity and cultural ties, as Armstrong was in Ghana for the elevation of Kwame Nkrumah to prime minister, and he played Black and Blue there at the inauguration events, and how Nkrumah was sitting there with tears in his eyes, and how they asked Louis Armstrong at the time, who had been criticized for not being involved in the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. So, they asked Armstrong, what do you think about this Little Rock situation? And he called Governor Faubus of Arkansas an undereducated plowboy. He said that Eisenhower should take those children by the hand and lead them into Little Rock Central High School. By the way, though, shout out to Dunbar High School, where a lot of those kids came from before they came to Central. But I remember that as he's being interviewed, Armstrong, who wasn't known for doing these public kind of critiques, Louise Armstrong, his wife, was standing next to him, and you could see her kind of rocking, looking around like, be careful, Louis, they're going to take you out, man, for talking like this. But I guess this question, and of course we know shortly thereafter, or kind of like around the same time, the U.S. State Department starts sending out these Black musicians like Ellington and Dizzy Gillespie and others to sell this soft sell American exceptionalism around the world. And of course, it has unintended consequences, as you write about in your book, Jazz and Justice, in part, Gerald. But this question of solidarity and global solidarity and how that has benefited us domestically, you raised that just before we heard the music. I'm wondering if you could say some more about that, particularly when we're in the moment where you see a reparations conversation being reignited in this country, but there's a strain in it that has become dangerously intertwined with almost a Black nativism, almost a turn inward instead of global solidarity, which plays right into the hands of those who would prefer us to keep these challenges within the four corners of the U.S., or metaphorical four corners, and not engage in global solidarity. How important is global solidarity to these domestic movements we need to be involved in?
Well, it's the alpha and the omega. Just to repeat, for those who may have tuned in late, I think that one of the major reasons we were able to escape the chains of slavery was because of events external to the United States. The rise of the Haitian Revolution by 1804, the rise of British abolitionism shortly thereafter, and certainly to escape Jim Crow. That has everything to do with African and Caribbean nations coming to independence, and the United States finding it difficult to appeal to these nations as long as people of African descent in this country are being treated so atrociously. So that creates a dynamic that leads to the loosening of the bonds of Jim Crow, which brings us to today. And what's remarkable about today is, fortunately, as you suggest, there is this discourse about the reparations. But if we are students of history, we recognize that reparations will be a pipe dream unless and until we can create a favorable global climate for reparations, which then brings me to legislation that has been endorsed by apparently the entire Congressional Black Caucus, carried by Congressman Gregory Meeks, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee from Southeast Queens, which calls upon the United States to penalize and pulverize African nations who do not endorse the U.S. view with regard to the conflict in Ukraine. Now, on the one hand, we're talking seriously about the recrudescence of fascism in the United States, which once again suggests that we're going to have to make appeals to the international community. And yet we're talking about endorsing sanctions against African nations when we're going to have to appeal to them to get these neo-fascists to take their knee off our neck. There's something inconsistent. There's something incongruent about that. And that brings me, of course, not only to the Black liberation movement, but as noted and suggested, we are predominantly a working class community. And I do not think that with regard to international solidarity, our interests have been served well by the labor movement, particularly the AFL-CIO and its international arm. You know, in my book on Southern Africa, White Supremacy Confronted, I talk about the turning point with regard to the liberation of Southern Africa, which is the revolution in Portugal in 1974. Now, what's interesting as I write is that the US government and embassy were ready to throw in the towel. Say, you know, it's all over.
Yes.
Left us one. The AFL-CIO representatives show up and say, man up, this is not over. And proceed to try to destabilize the Portuguese. And that, of course, has not been inconsistent with the foreign policy of the AFL-CIO. We have more Black people in unions, the Service Employees International Union and Federation of Government Employees, American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. That's in part because we get a better shake from the government because we vote to help determine who are the representatives in the government as opposed to the private sector, where we're mostly not shareholders and therefore get stabbed in the neck. But we have these organizations like, as noted, the Coalition of Labor and Union Women, Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. We really need to do a better job in the labor movement. And we see that Rich Trumka, the Mine Workers Union, just passed away. He was leader of the AFL-CIO for years, replaced by Liz Shuler. I don't detect any change in direction, but if we are to escape the snares of neo-fascism, there's going to have to be a change in direction with regard. And
Gerald, if I can jump in with this one, I'm sure you would agree the role of the McCarthyism during the 50s in deliberately infiltrating and threatening and weakening the labor movement, so that they didn't necessarily just do that without some threats and coercion. And that's number one. And Gerald, I'm sure you could speak to that. I mean, I remember those days, even though I was very much of a child. I do remember the role of the McCarthy period in weakening labor. And also, I must say, I believe we are on a new moment with labor, with the Amazon union. I was at the rally in Staten Island several months ago. Very, very inspiring. The young people coming together to fight the second richest man in the world, and so far more or less winning, as well as Starbucks. Hundreds of Starbucks stores have now been unionized. So of course there has been a serious issue with labor, but I believe we may be on the moment of a new labor movement.
You think so, Joni? I mean, that's interesting you say that, because I from a distance, of course, I'm getting that same feeling, particularly from these young people. And then, Gerald, when you mentioned George Crockett, I mean, it reminded me of Detroit. Exactly. I thought about drum and all the. Are there lessons we can learn from these previous movements in labor and these other movements? And you kind of evoked a couple of the organizations, the formations, Gerald, not only in South Africa but here, that could pull that movement in another direction. Because Joni, I agree with you. I mean, it's interesting to see how these young people perhaps aren't playing by the same rules as previous iterations in labor.
Well, with regard to the labor movement, certainly there were malign external forces such as McCarthyism pushing the labor movement in a reactionary direction. But I don't think we should deny George Meany and Lane Kirkland of agency.
Right.
We were willing to direct the House of Labor in that direction and actually collaborated with the reactionaries. And I mentioned how the NAACP should make amends to Robeson and Du Bois. I think the AFL-CIO at its next convention should make amends to the labor leaders they collaborated against. I wrote an entire book about Ferdinand Smith of Jamaica,
the
founder of the National Maritime Union, and of course was.
For those of you want to get that book, of course, that's Red Seas, right, Gerald?
That's right, and then ousted, not least with the complicity of his alleged comrades in the National Maritime Union, and goes on to become a leader of independent struggles in Jamaica. Or the attempt to expel progressive unions like United Electrical Workers, the attempt
right. That was
definitely
McCarthy period, though, Gerald.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying, there was agency on the part of George Meany and Lane Kirkland, et cetera. It wasn't as if George Meany and Lane Kirkland and those like them were opposed to these maneuvers. In fact, they were oftentimes leading the crusade. So the labor they need to make amends to Harry Bridges, the founder of the ILWU, the late Harry Bridges, who they conspired against for a number of decades on spurious anti-communist grounds. And I think as well that we cannot begin to have a serious struggle against these right-wing forces who are determined to hold on to power by any means necessary, as exemplified by January 6, 2021, whereas recent testimony reveals the U.S. president at that time, Donald J. Trump, was trying to lead an armed mob into Capitol. The only thing missing from the testimony was that he had a white horse stashed off stage that he would ride down Pennsylvania Avenue at the head of the protesters.
No question.
That in fact happened by November 2024, January 2025.
Yes. No, Gerald, I didn't want us to. I want us to take full advantage of having you here for this time to really ask you your thoughts on a figure like A. Philip Randolph in this conversation, because again, when the civil rights movement is romanticized, it's seen one way in terms of even the support of organized labor and solidarity. And we know, of course, Randolph, who in the 20s and 30s even gets caught up in the Garvey must go, but who was an open socialist and under surveillance and attacked by the federal government. By the time that you're narrating the AFL-CIO, of course, this kind of domestic turn, this turn inward in some veins, it seemed to me, like Thurgood Marshall against this internationalism, even as some people, including one of his lieutenants, Anna Arnold Hedgeman, who is one of the people who actually pushes to get Malcolm X involved in the movement. And, the so-called March on Washington in 1943, of course, before Malcolm, and then, of course, 60. How do you read A. Philip Randolph in this very necessary re-examination of the role of labor in the domestic freedom movement in the United States?
Well, as suggested, A. Philip Randolph played a historic role in organizing the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was a major force, not only in terms of contributing its treasury to anti-Jim Crow movements, but also a major force in terms of distributing anti-racist propaganda, because these trains, before the rise of transcontinental flight, were the major force transporting individuals from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and they could drop off newspapers, drop off leaflets, etc. However, I think that A. Philip Randolph did not stand tall, to put it mildly, during the anti-communist purges of the 1950s. Now, there have been a number of books and others to come, basically sort of hagiographies of A. Philip Randolph, basically gliding past what I've just articulated. But once again, I think that we can no longer can accept the luxury, on the one hand, complaining about we're on the brink of disaster, which we are, but on the other hand, continuing to salute and praise those leaders whose missteps, misjudgments, and misdeeds have led us to the brink of disaster.
Right.
But Gerald, we're not necessarily saluting the leaders. We're also saluting the young people who are stepping up to the plate. And Jared, we're going to have them on this show in the near future. Maybe you could hop in and talk to some of them. They're really a new generation of organizing for rights on the job. And I think both you and Greg, maybe we could have another special with them, because they've been on.
Joni, but I just wanted to make sure that, because this is, again, is so, here we are on July 4th, 2022. And I guarantee you, I have not heard, maybe you have, Gerald, or maybe you have, Joni. I haven't heard the type of lovingly critical, because, Philip Randolph is a hero to many generations. My grandfather was a farmer in Alabama, and they tried to recruit him into the brotherhood, because he had been assigned a job in Connecticut and he refused to go. But I'm saying all that to say that what you said, what Gerald just said, what you said, Gerald, is so important, because the propaganda, the way that the airbrushing of our movements, to think about Cedric Robinson when he wrote Black Movements in America, we turn individuals against their own wishes into these kind of unassailable icons, when in fact we have to learn from all of their lives and movements. And so, these young people are in the spirit and tradition, particularly of those early days, because we know the brotherhood was beyond the United States, as we know. It's written about in Canada and other places. But, this conversation, I don't know, Joni and Gerald, delayering it like this, there are people who recognize some of these names. And certainly when you say the name Martin Luther King, who have only seen the sanitized versions, if at all, of this history that show organized labor as an unfailing partner, without understanding these types of subtleties, so that these young people, as you say, Joni, who are coming into this movement, and not just young people, as people are becoming aware, they need this. Because otherwise we will, to go back to what you said a few minutes ago, Gerald, we will make the same mistakes if we don't recognize the rhythms in this struggle. But anyway, that's what I wanted to mention.
That's true. And I'm sorry, Gerald, and then we're going to jump into the question in a moment of voting, which we need to talk about in terms of what is to be done. But Gerald, before we do that, did you want to jump in?
Well, yes.
Again?
Yeah, just to jerk us back on this alleged celebration of July 4th, 1776, to jerk us back to the past. And a couple points I'd like to make. I don't think we can say enough about the Haitian Revolution, not only because of what I've already mentioned in terms of it's the key to unlocking why abolitionism took place hemisphere-wide, not only hemisphere-wide, but of course it had knock-on effects with regard to the slave trade going to the Ottoman Empire from southern Sudan, from parts of Uganda, as far south as what is now Tanzania. So it's a monumental event. And we can't say enough about the book by CLR James, Black Jacobins, which is one of the first books to underscore the significance. And I think that the critics of CLR James's political orientation need to ask why it took until the late 1930s for this successful movement of the oppressed to receive the book-length treatment that it so richly deserved. But I think it's also important to recognize that the Haitian Revolution was not only a new beginning with regard to the establishment of the first Black Republic, it was a culmination. Because to pick up on something I said a moment or two ago, the oppressed class of enslaved Africans in North America, like their counterparts and peers throughout the hemisphere and perhaps throughout the world, were not only seeking to break the chains of oppression, they were grasping for power. And that's one of the points that I was trying to make in my 1776 book, which is that the settlers felt, particularly in Georgia, which I have a whole chapter about, pre-1776, that if they did not do something, the Africans would seize power. And it's that prospect that helped to galvanize their racism, that helped to galvanize their attempt to suppress African rebelliousness by any means necessary. And when you speak about the settlers, we must talk about the construction of whiteness. Now, fortunately, there's been a lot of writing about that, which I salute. And we need to understand that, because otherwise you can't understand how and why it is that so many Europeans crossed the Atlantic and sunk into a bog of opportunism. I mean, look, the Irish travelers, for example, who today in Ireland are the mudsill of society. They're treated worse than Negroes under Jim Crow. today in Ireland.
Mm.
Yet, if they cross the Atlantic, they could adopt this new militarized, monetized identity politics of whiteness and rise to the top levels of society. Of course, you have to ignore the niggling detail that this comes at the expense of Native Americans and Africans, but apparently that was seen as worth the price. And once again, you can't begin to understand this construction of whiteness without understanding its religious roots. That's one of the reasons why it has been so persistent. That is to say that, as I talk about in my book on the 16th century, how was it that this minor monarchy on the fringes of Europe, speaking of England in the first instance, are able to rise to the top of global supremacy? Part of it has to do with its contestation with the Catholic powers. London, as you know, adopted the Protestant faith a few decades after Martin Luther nailed the theses on the door in 1517, and wanted to participate in the feast that was colonialism. There were not enough Protestants to go around for them to mimic the Spanish, whereas in Cuba, for example, in the 1500s, an African could be a conquistador if an African professed Catholicism. Now, that did not bar the Spanish from enslaving Africa. And in a sense, it's mimicking what we have in the United States today, where you have these prison labor camps full to the brim with Black people. And yet there is a celebration, I understand, of the election of a Black president in 2008 and the election of 2012. So what happens is that England stumbles into a kind of pan-Europeanism in order to bulk up its settler project. That is to say, making deals with those with whom it had been warring, English versus Irish, English versus Scot, for example, then British versus German, German versus Russian, Irish traveler versus non-Irish traveler. I mean, the list is long. And it's not accidental, as historians like to say, that when the music stops and the British Empire begins to retreat and recede, that then you begin to get these stirrings. You begin to get these stirrings with regard to Scottish independence. Another vote is going to come next year. You begin to get these stirrings even in Spain, where you have a serious movement with regard to independence of Catalonia. So once again, I don't think that we've been served well by many of our historians. They've had a certain kind of tunnel vision. I've drawn the analogy of the Rodney King trial. You recall that he was the Black motorist captured on camera being beaten by the authorities about 30 odd years ago. And what happens is that during the trial, the defense lawyers, rather than showing the tape seamlessly, one frame after another, they break up the tape into frames. And why I'm here, you see a crime. And that's what they're doing. I mean, they don't look at the continuous loop of settler colonialism, not only from 1492 forward, but perhaps from 1453, when the Christians suffer a stinging defeat in what is now Istanbul at the hands of the Muslims, or even going back to the Crusades and studying it forward. They'll take out a little piece like 1850 to 1865, and then overdetermine the progressivism of Lincoln, and then get into spats where they all want to, censor their opponents or even pulverize their opponents for daring to disagree. So we have a lot of work.
Wait. I'm going to jump in here.
Yeah,
just to let everybody know, we are now entering the last half hour of this 2-hour special with Dr. Gerald Horne and Dr. Greg CARR, The Farce of You Lie, Understanding the Roots of U.S. Fascism and What is to be Done. And in our remaining less than 30, about 30 minutes, we're going to really focus in on what is to be done. We need to talk about the issue of voting, maybe reparations. But before we do that, we're going to hear a remix of A Change Is Gonna Come. Let's go, Kalia.
A change gonna come. Change come. Oh, yes, it will. I was born by the river in a little tent. Oh, and just like the river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gon' come. A change gon' come. A change gon' come. A change gon' come.
Okay, change gonna come. Well, we need to talk about what can we do now. What is to be done to make that change coming? It's been a long time coming. And I think we need to talk about voting. As we know, there's a big debate, I would say, in the progressive community and certainly on WPFW and Pacifica about the issue of voting. And I've heard both Greg Carr and Gerald speak to that. So let's jump right in.
But Gerald, before you go to voting, and just to reinforce, because of course it is the 4th of July, the point that you just led us into before we heard Brother Sam remix there, the whole notion of grand narratives of history. I mean, as we know, there was a moment among historians and memory keepers where there was this kind of focus on specific events and chopping things up, as you say, using the metaphor that you powerfully evoke of Rodney King, freeze framing inch by inch. But you have done so much work in terms of grand narratives, kind of reframing narratives. And that's really the only kind of way we can begin to think about that, because you're right. People want to focus on individual events, individual people and moments, and then except on ritual days like this. And it reminds, of course, of what Fred Douglass said when he asked what to the slave is the 4th of July. And he says, you know, your celebration's a sham, your boasted liberty and unholy license, your national greatness, swelling vanity. And then he goes into the rituals. He says your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parades and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. So, yeah, the grand narratives of American exceptionalism or any form of nationalist kind of boasting, yeah, it all gets lost in the weeds until days like this, where the grand narrative is imposed on us again. And so, kind that to the voting question, Joni and Gerald, please help us with this, because you kind of began with the Supreme Court decisions. And of course, we've got some coming up on the fall docket that Ketanji Brown Jackson and Sonia Sotomayor are not going to be able to stop around voting. You know, the kind of, I suppose you could almost say in their defense, act of self-defense from some folk who say, well, I'm not voting because nothing ever changes. The Democrats and the Republicans are the same. Kind of at these moments of ritual kind of celebration, you know, folk rightfully so shrink from this notion of patriotism and the flag waving and all that. But then they tie it to a sense that I'm not participating in anything, including exercising the franchise, because it's all the same. Help us turn away from that kind of oversimplification of this struggle. I mean, how important is the vote, and how should we even be using it? Gerald, do you think?
Well, let me mention another book, which has recently come out, edited by Linda Burnham, longtime activist in the Bay Area, and others. The title is Power Concedes Nothing. Of course, that's a play on the phrase by Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand, and never has and never will. And it talks a lot about voting, but it talks about it in the context of mass mobilization. They talk about these campaigns in Georgia, for example, where these activist groups knocked on tens of thousands of doors, made hundreds of thousands of phone calls. That is to say, I understand why someone just saying that my casting a ballot seems like spitting into the ocean, spitting into the wind. You have to connect it to some sort of mass movement that has a larger agenda of transformation. And unless you have that, and of course, I made a critique of the Democratic Party a moment ago as to how it oftentimes shuns, if not attacks, those to their left, even though we know historically, if you look at the labor movement, the reason the labor movement was able to expand so aggressively in the 1930s and hardly has expanded to the same extent since then was because there was this collaboration in the CIO between Marxist communist forces and liberal and centrist forces. But that seemed to go against the creed of the United States of America. It seemed to go against the creed, which suggests that any movement on the left is involved in redistribution of the wealth. And since Black people are disproportionately cited at the bottom, that means that they would benefit handsomely from that, which of course angers the descendants of slave owners and the descendants of the original reactionary settlers who feel that Black people should be punished and pulverized forevermore for having the gumption not to have supported 1776 and then to have joined the Lincoln Army in the 1860s to administer a punishing defeat upon the slave owning class. So as I know we're getting close to the end, let me reiterate some points that I've already made and embellish others. Obviously, as noted, the NAACP, and referenced my remarks earlier, needs to head in a different direction. The reparations movement, which I support wholeheartedly and just accomplished and attained a major victory in the state of California, needs to realize that unless that movement is globalized and internationalized, given the preponderance of the right wing in this country, it's destined to be a pipe dream unless it is internationalized. With regard to the AFL-CIO, like the NAACP, they should apologize to those that they ousted unceremoniously on anti-communist grounds. I mentioned Ferdinand Smith, for example, but they also need to look forward and ally with the World Federation of Trade Unions, which they shunned during the Red Scare, supposedly because of its communist orientation. But the AFL-CIO needs to realize that it needs all the help that it can get, and it too can benefit from worker solidarity internationally. And in that regard, it needs to pay careful and close attention to its left-wing critics, the critics in Labor Notes, the critics in Labor Today, for example. You can even see the workers who have been organizing in Amazon and Starbucks, many of whom have shunned affiliation with AFL-CIO unions thus far, as being implicit critics of the labor movement who need to be understood, and we need to pay attention to them.
Man, that's absolutely. And let me just jump in for a moment and say that the Labor Notes Conference, which Gerald just mentioned, 4,000, mostly young people attended that conference in Chicago. So that is a reason to hope. And I wanted to just jump in, Gerald. You talked about the mass movement, that we need to pay attention to the mass movement in Georgia, for instance, which brought out thousands of organizers to get out and vote. Mostly Black women did that organizing. But we need to be a part of that, participate in mobilizing those movements, especially right now. We don't need to be sitting on the sidelines. So, Greg, what are your thoughts about, and I heard you talk about it recently, about voting. We often hear people on these airwaves constantly saying, there's no reason to vote. And they move on and never clear what it is we're going to do. But how would you fit voting into the whole array of things that we do need to do to change this, try to keep moving forward instead of backwards?
I don't think we can afford to abandon any tool in our struggle. And the way Gerald just laid that out, bringing together our last hour and a half so powerfully. I mean, the NAACP and by proxy other organizations having to go in a new and a different direction, the reparations movement with victories that look like longer arc victories, but in fact can be forestalled and turned, as you say, Gerald, into a pipe dream if that isn't globalized in terms of global solidarity movements and linking up. And then how you narrated through the AFL-CIO the need to link to these international organizations like the World Federation of Trade Unions. And we need all the help we can get, as you say. I think voting is a local action that must also be linked to these very much more broad patterns and movements. And I'm so glad you evoked Power Concedes Nothing, Gerald, because I think in that book and in the movements that that book documents, there's a great deal of evidence supporting how voting matters when it is attached to organizing. I remember our sister Linda Sarsour during the elections, in fact, on the Pacifica Network, Joni, was one of the times we were covering the election, right? So I'm sorry, Joni, go ahead. What you about to say?
And you can listen to Linda Sarsour every Wednesday morning on WBAI from 7 to 8 a.m. She now has a weekly show.
Oh, that's powerful. Thank you. I'm so glad. Thank you. Again, the importance of this network, the importance of Pacifica. She says, remember her remarking in passing, she said, we want our best opponents in electoral positions. If we can't have someone in the immediate offing that we can elect to electoral office who is absolutely with us, who represents us, then we certainly need to have people who we can force to do what we need them to do. And it's better to have someone who is not an outright fascist and white nationalist. And the fascists are organizing to put their people in place. And we have to pay attention to how local politics speaks to this larger strategy. Recently, Bakari Sellers, whose father, of course, is a stalwart in the human rights movement and struggle in the 1960s and 70s. Cleve Sellers, comrade and SNCC comrade of Kwame Ture and so many others, Dory Ladner and many others. Bakari has come out against Rashida Tlaib in Detroit and supporting a kind of establishment Democrat politician who is of African descent. But the money funding the attack on Rashida Tlaib is not coming from Black or progressive or working class people. And in fact, there are a number of single interest folk who are pumping money into trying to get Rashida Tlaib out of the federal legislature. And of course, we see something very similar. We saw some of those similar strains against Nina Turner in Ohio and so forth and so on. But I say all that to bring it to this point, and Gerald has already evoked it. If voting weren't a potential, not remedy, but firewall against, and in some ways tool to engage in this kind of restructuring of the society we live in, then the fascists wouldn't be working so hard to deprive us. And people say, yeah. Okay, well, let's get very much more specific. And again, in the few minutes we have left, it's just, it's wonderful to have you here, Gerald, because you can help walk us through this. I was talking to, and Joni, you mentioned our sister Karen Hunter and the work we do. And she is interviewing, I think she taped an interview that she's going to put today on her platform with Sirius, an interview with Tom Hartman, who is a kind of progressive writer, blogger. And Hartman has sketched out this kind of scenario where in the election of 2024, the Democratic presidential candidate, whether it be Biden or whoever, and again, Gavin Newsom looks like he's lining up to make a charge because what he did, DeSantis and them boys in that ad that he dropped in Florida the other day just made me laugh out loud, among many others did the same, of course. But Hartman lays out this scenario where in 2024, the Democrats in the presidential election win the exact same states that they won in the election of 2020. In fact, increase the popular vote, but win the electoral college as well. But in critical states controlled by the white nationalist party, they call it the Republican Party, but I think, in some ways we got to just reimagine even that. The white nationalist party controlling legislatures and armed with this theory of the independent legislature that we saw Samuel Alito begin to preview. Remember when Pennsylvania looked like it was going to be in doubt in terms of who won the election? Alito, in the Supreme Court's decision, advises the Pennsylvanians to sequester the votes that are being disputed, and make no mistake, those votes from basically Philadelphia, those black votes, because we might have to revisit this. Alito was hot to try to figure out if they could steal the election of 2020, but he couldn't get it close enough to steal. But what Hartman says is in 2024, if the Democrats say win Georgia, and the Georgia legislature could then say, well, we're going to substitute our will for the will of the majority that voted in Georgia and award those electoral votes to the Republican nominee, which probably, I don't know whether it be Donald Trump, but the one to worry about, and Gerald, I'll be interested in hearing what you had to say about something about 30 seconds from closing. DeSantis out of Florida, who has been described in this recent New Yorker article, among many other places, as Trump with a brain, that could be done by these Republican legislatures. And what Hartman is saying, what he told Karen, is that there would be support for that at the Supreme Court level, this independent judiciary. So there could be a coup in this country, and it could be all legal by judge-made interpretations of the voting rights that are enshrined in the federal Constitution. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Gerald, but point is that we need to vote so that to even get to that scenario, we got to win those elections, and it's better to have your better opponents in elective office than not. But I don't know, Gerald, if you have any thoughts about it.
Well, sure. I mean, I think we began by talking about July 4th, 1776, allegedly and purportedly igniting the so-called grand democratic experiment. And then we wind up talking about the distinct possibilities of coups and fascism. And so obviously what that bespeaks is that the traditional narrative of 1776, indeed of most of US history, needs to be overthrown. It's moth-eaten. It's no longer sustainable. It may have been effective in the 1960s when you were trying to stress liberal remedies of giving Black people the right to eat at restaurants, and you were trying to show how this supposedly stemmed from the Constitution, but we're in a different era now. And so we need different stories. Now, with regard to those theories, well, I mean, look at John Eastman, the hopefully disgraced law professor, former clerk of Clarence Thomas, who in many ways was the brain behind seeking to have the electoral college coup. I recommend that folks look at the letter that he wrote to the Wall Street Journal just a week or two ago, where he lays out some of his theories that he claims are grounded in the Constitution. Obviously, his opponents disagree. But the point is, rather than an abstruse argument amongst different sets of lawyers, this is going to be a battle determined by who can deliver the most troops on the ground. And right now, with regard to that, you see in states like Michigan and other states that the Republicans and the White Nationalist Party, as you put it, are moving to take over the office of Secretary of State, which then has oversight over time, manner, and place of elections, counting ballots, etc. Not only that, but in addition to these paramilitary groupings, such as the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters and the Michigan Militia, who somehow were not convicted of seeking to kidnap and then liquidate the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, when she came under attack by Mr. Trump about a year or two ago. Well, the Washington Post did a very striking piece just a few days ago about how you have analogous groupings springing up like mushrooms after a spring rain. In Colorado, you have this group FEC United, Faith, Education, Commerce, where the leaders not only helped to get the Republican nomination again for Laura Boebert, the QAnon sympathizer who sits in the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C., but they continue to make, quote, jokes, unquote, about executing the governor of Colorado, Governor Pohl, for example. So, you know, that's Trump's old trick. He'll make an outrageous statement and then say he was joking. So we have a lot of work. And I would be remiss if I talk about what is to be done and then just singling out NAACP and the AFL-CIO, et cetera, without talking about support of the Pacifica Network.
Yes, sir.
I mean, it's like physician heal thyself. I mean, this is the network we should be pumping up and should be trumpeting, because where else can you have this kind of discussion taking place? Certainly you won't find it on these weekend cable networks who, as you may have noticed, continue to follow the Democratic Party line by not inviting on their airwaves anybody to the left of liberal, which means that they are in some ways paving the way for the effective resurgence of the white nationalist party.
Yes, sir.
Absolutely.
Yes,
and
sir.
let me just jump in and thank, as Greg started to do, thank Gerald Horne for his contribution during our fund drive. Thanks to Gerald, we definitely surpassed our goal. We sold many, I shouldn't say so, many listeners pledged for his wonderful book.
Yeah, Gerald, you might end up having a hand cramp, brother, because Joni at the celebration that you all put together for our sister Dory, I said, "Wow, they really pledged for that." And then you gave me a number that blew my mind. I didn't realize that many people.
Yes, 105 people pledged for Gerald's wonderful book. Of course, thanks to Esther as well. But absolutely, and we still, Greg and Gerald, need to talk about some kind of book club we could have on the airwaves in collaboration with your network, Greg. But we need to keep this conversation.
Let me just say right quick, Joni, in 30 seconds, I know we're up against the clock, but you have to give the brother flowers while he's here.
Yes.
Gerald, representing all the organizations, all the formations, all of the momentum of memory that you have convened. Nevertheless, it is through your pen and your voice to the tune of dozens of books, each one just incredibly hard hitting. And again, even just in passing, we mentioned Black Revolutionary, your book on William Patterson. There's so many things. I'm glad you mentioned Red Seas. We didn't talk about that before, but I'll end with this. We have to thank you, brother, because not only have you been steadfast, but your God or creator or ancestors given gift of analysis and ability to reduce that to print. And plus, the young people would say bars, the way that you create phrases that just stick with us. You've deployed that and continue to deploy that for the service of our common humanity. And we all great debt to you, brother. I just wanted to say that, man. Again,
absolutely.
Anyway.
Absolutely.
Perhaps in that context, to pump up another organization, ASALA, the Associations for the Study of African American Life and History.
Yes.
A founder, Carter G. Woodson, headquarters not far distant from where the WPFW station is in Washington, D.C., a former professor at Greg Carr's Howard University. In terms of nurturing the next generation of scholars and writers who are going to reframe the history of this country and make for a more accurate reading. In many ways, it begins with ASALA. It begins with the Journal of African American History. And those are two entities that deserve support.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Absolutely. And I believe the executive director of ASALA is very much a part of WPFW, Lewis Hicks, and other people are definitely connected to us. So we have time for each of you to give your last comment. I want to thank our wonderful engineer, Kalia, who hung in there with us. And stay tuned, of course, to special programming throughout the day. I'm not sure what it's going to be, but I'm sure it's going to be great. I want to also thank Crystal, who helps me create these shows and the beautiful flyers. And last but not least, I want to thank our ancestors for encouraging us to keep on keeping on, despite the very frightening moment that we're in, as Gerald Horde describes it. We're at a pre-fascist moment here in the United States. So with that said, I'm going to give Gerald and Greg the last word.
Joni, let me go first to get out of Gerald's way, because and that way we'll let our brother in for us. And thank you, Joni, for putting this together, by having us working on, I was calling it White Juneteenth, but I don't want to lower Juneteenth to that. But we're working on White Juneteenth. But I'll end with the words of Fred Douglass, where you wanted me to read from his What to the Slave at the beginning, where he says, "Go where you may, search where you will. Roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world. Travel through South America. Search out every abuse. And when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival." With Fred Douglass, and turn it over to our brothers.
and just also want to lift up Jalen Walker as we go. Many people have not even heard about him yet.
That's right.
Shot in the back, I think 90 times just this Saturday. So talk about fascism, and it's just and there's been warnings out that you may not want to watch it. I have not watched it yet, but it's just horrific. So he is now an ancestor that we will lift up his spirit and keep on mobilizing to stop this moving force of fascism.
Yes.
and move in towards a more positive direction. But Gerald, you have the last word before we hear a little bit of Donny Hathaway.
Well, first of all, thank you and WPFW for opening up your airwaves to this discussion. Certainly, I appreciate it. Secondly, for those who are trying to monitor the rise of this fascist monster, pay careful and close attention to any political assassinations, particularly attempted political assassinations. Pay attention to what I just said about what's happening in Colorado, so-called jokes, unquote, about executing high-level political officials. Pay careful and close attention to the killings, such as the one we've highlighted this morning, sadly, that of Jayland Walker. If those begin to proliferate, which I suspect they will, you will get a suspicion, a justifiable suspicion, that fascism has crept ever closer. Pay close and careful attention to the death penalty. Despite this article in the New York Times yesterday, which suggested that the death penalty is withering, the memo was not received in the state of Oklahoma because in the next 24 months, they plan to execute dozens of mostly Black and Indigenous men, I'm afraid to say. What happens in Oklahoma does not necessarily stay in Oklahoma. I think that it will probably have knock-on effects, certainly in Texas, where they hardly need motivation to begin to revving up the death machine, and not to mention Louisiana, where its leading prison, as you know, Angola State Prison, ironically, is named after the Southwest African nation from. And let me also reiterate the message I began with regard to our friends on the U.S. left. They really need to return to their own principles. One of their principles I've been made to understand is the idea of class struggle. You should look at the struggles of Black people, not least in the 18th century, through the lens of class struggle and ask what was their interest, what was their motivation to engage in class collaboration and aligning with their so-called masters post July 4th, 1776. And if you say, well, they could see ahead to 1965, the Voting Rights Act, well, I don't know, that sounds like fantasy. But then you need to also ask, as I mentioned on the Juneteenth episode, why and how it was in August 1814, when the Redcoats attacked Washington, D.C., so many Black people in Washington, D.C. joined the Redcoats and then fled on British ships to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. So once again, you need on the left to reinvigorate the idea of class struggle, just like you need to reinvigorate the idea of class collaboration in order to stop making excuses for the 74 million who voted for Donald J. Trump in 2020 and acting as the reason they voted for Donald J. Trump was because Biden wasn't sufficiently left. Well, I mean, that's a non sequitur. Then why did they vote 55% strong for governor of Louisiana, David Duke, a fascist and a Nazi and a Klans leader in 1991? It took an overwhelming turnout from Black Americans during that particular election to keep Louisiana from going fascist 30 years ago. And so there are a lot of lessons to be learned. And another lesson I might add is return to your concept of materialism. Give a material analysis of the Second Amendment, for example, a well-regulated militia in order to suppress Native American rebellions and rebellions of enslaved Africans, and stop giving so much credit to the Bill of Rights unless you agree that Native Americans should have been expropriated and rebellious Africans should have been suppressed.
Yes, yes.
Gerald Horne, thank you, Greg Carr. Gerald Horne, author of more than 40 books, including the one we just offered for our pledge drop. We thank him immensely, as we thank Greg Carr. And the next time we talk, one subject we didn't discuss is a little bit of hope to our neighbors south of the border, which Gerald Horne always likes to emphasize, that we need to build those allies with Colombia and, of course, with Cuba, etc., in order to bring us closer to maybe winning or moving in a more positive direction. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Gerald. And let's go out per Gerald's request or suggestion with a little bit of Donny Hathaway. Thanks again, Kalia, and stay tuned to WPFW Jazz and Justice Radio for the rest of this day of You Lie.